Systemic racism, also known as institutionalized racism, is defined as a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. To get a sense of what people thought on this topic, we interviewed them. Here's what we got.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
I do not believe that systemic racism exists today.
One of the places that systemic racism exists is in the economy, so we took a poll to see what people thought about the wealth gap, and this is what they said. Compared with a much smaller 8% gap in 2010, the wealth of white households in America today is 13 times that of black households. This is the highest point since 1989, when whites had 17 times the wealth of black households. In 2011, the average white household had over $111,000 in wealth holdings, compared to $7,000 for that of the median black household. That's a pretty big difference. Another graph shows the same difference in the wealth gap. The wealth accumulation for white families is much more than that of black families and Latino families. So what can this wealth gap be attributed to? What could be causing such a wealth gap between races in this country? The causes of this wealth gap can be due partly to the systemic racism that exists in the education and employment sectors, so let's take a look at employment. We took another Twitter poll to see if people thought there was racial discrimination in the workforce, and again, the results were a resounding yes. It should be noted that it is illegal to discriminate against an applicant or employee based on their race, but employers seem to do that anyway. In July of 2001 through May of 2002, an experiment was conducted to catch employers' perception of race. While the resumes were all exactly identical, resumes with very white-sounding names were almost 50% more likely to be called for a first interview than that of the resumes with very African-American sounding names. The unemployment rates in 2013 were 9.7% for whites who never even finished high school. The unemployment rate for blacks who completed high school and some college were 10.5%. Even though this difference is small, these numbers say a lot. They say that if you're white, and even if you haven't completed high school, you are still more likely to get a job than an African American person who has completed high school and some college. Now let's take a look at education. Even as young as preschoolers, black students can experience systemic racism through education. A government study shows that only 18% of preschoolers are black, but make up 46% of students who receive suspension multiple times, compared with white students that represent 43% of preschoolers, but only receive 26% of suspension multiple times. We even asked people if they thought that they saw racism in their school, and this is what they said. Finally, let's move on to the place that perhaps the most systemic racism exists, the criminal justice system. The racism that exists in the criminal justice system is obvious. These are the facts. For example, did you know that black males only make up 14% of the national population, but they are 38% of the national prison population? When it comes to general sentencing, a 2012 study done by the United States Sentencing Commission found that black sentences are nearly 20% longer than whites. Many people have argued that the reason for this difference in numbers between whites and blacks is because black people commit crimes, especially drug crimes, more than white people. But according to a study from Substance Abuse and Mental Health Data Archive, whites are more likely to do illegal drugs but are less likely to be jailed for it. These graphs are outstanding. We can see that, although blacks and whites use drugs at about the same rate, African Americans are arrested at a much higher rate than whites are. We are left to wonder, so what can we do about it? What can we do to solve the issue of systemic racism against African Americans? This racism has been a part of American lives for centuries. Racism is problematic for the mere discretion that it is in fact not a normal topic of discussion. We interviewed people to see if talking about systemic racism made them uncomfortable, and here's what they said.
Absolutely.
Racism has been woven into our everyday lives, and we are unaware of its doings unless clearly demonstrated. Racism is regularly viewed as a negative and demeaning topic, which is causing us to be unable to recognize how it is systematic, historical, and reverberates through the media, culture, and in our institutions. So let's start talking about it.